They told her she was marrying a killer, the stagecoach driver warned her. The passengers stared with pity. Even a stranger begged her to run. But Eleanor Price had nowhere left to run. She was 23, orphaned, and starving in Boston. Her only options? The factory foreman whose hands wandered too freely, or a man in Colorado who had buried 3 men with his own hands. She chose the killer. What happened next will make you question everything you believe about dangerous men, and the women brave enough to love them. Because sometimes, the most terrifying choice is the only path to freedom, and sometimes the man everyone fears is the only one who can keep you safe. This story reminds us that home is not a place on a map. It is the courage to trust again after life has broken you. It is choosing love over fear, even when everyone says you are making a mistake. If you believe in second chances and love that defies the odds, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from today. And if this story touches your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Now, let us begin. Just 3 months earlier, Eleanor was trapped in a Boston boarding house, the smell of mildew and misery thick in the air. She worked 16-hour days at a textile mill ever since her mother passed away. It was a slow, painful wasting that Eleanor had to watch, completely helpless. Her mother's last gift was a leather-bound journal and a whispered plea. Don't let this city swallow you. Find somewhere you can breathe. A newspaper ad felt like an answer to that prayer. A Western rancher named C. Mercer needed a wife. He promised room, board, and protection. She did not know what he meant by protection, but it had to be better than the foreman at the mill whose hands wandered, or the landlady who threatened to throw her out on the street. So, she penned a careful reply. Caleb Mercer's answer came 3 weeks later. It was short and all business. He said it would be a practical partnership, not a romance. He included money for the long journey west, more cash than Eleanor had seen in ages. She accepted before fear could change her mind. Survival was all that mattered. That journey across America was a hard lesson in just how big and unforgiving the country could be. On the final stagecoach ride to Redemption Ridge, the driver, a grizzled old man named Hoskins, struck up a conversation. "Where are you headed, miss?" he asked. When Eleanor told him she was there to marry Caleb Mercer, a heavy silence fell over the coach. Every other passenger, from the whiskey salesman to the 2 gold prospectors, went quiet and just stared at her with pity in their eyes. Hoskins finally spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "you ought to know, Mercer's got a reputation. The war has been over for 2 years, but he ain't stopped fighting." He told her about 3 men who tried to steal Mercer's land. Mercer buried all 3 of them himself. Then there was the card cheat he shot in the saloon. He did not kill him, but he made sure the man would never play cards or walk right again. "I'm not saying the fellow was not cheating," Hoskins warned. "I am saying Mercer is a dangerous, dangerous man." A stern-faced woman on the coach leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Child, it is not too late. You can find work in town. It would be safer than marrying a man like that." It was a tempting offer of safety, but Eleanor knew it was just a different kind of trap, one that would lead back to poverty and desperation. "I appreciate your concern," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "but I have made my commitment." The rest of the ride was dead silent. She pulled out her mother's worn journal. The pages told a story of a life worn down by a city that took everything and gave nothing back. But on one of the last pages, her mother had written about Eleanor. "She is braver than she knows," the entry read. "I pray she uses that strength to find a better life. I pray she does not let fear make her choices." Eleanor closed the book, a new resolve hardening inside her. Maybe facing your fear was the only real way to survive. That night she dreamed of her mother, who smiled and said, "Sometimes the only way forward is through fear, not around it." Eleanor woke before dawn, feeling a strange calm. When the coach finally rolled into the valley, she saw Redemption Ridge. It was not much more than a handful of wooden buildings, huddled together like they were clinging on for dear life. The air was thin and smelled of pine. And somewhere in that town, a man named Caleb Mercer was waiting for her. Have you ever felt so cornered that your only way out was to run toward a bigger danger? That was Eleanor Price. Fleeing the filth and poverty of Boston, she used her last dollar to answer a mail-order bride ad from a man in Texas named Caleb Mercer. But the townspeople whispered he was a hard, violent man. This story is about facing your fears to find where you truly belong, and it reminds us that the quietest people often have the most to protect. If you believe in second chances, stay with me. The coach rattled into a dusty town that looked like it could blow away in a strong wind. The driver, a kind man named Hoskins, gave her one last chance to turn back. But for Eleanor, there was no back to go to. She stepped onto the packed dirt street, clutching a small trunk and her mother's journal. All around her, men in dusty clothes stopped to stare. Eleanor scanned their faces, wondering which one was Caleb Mercer. None of them moved. Hoskins set her trunk down. "You want me to ask around for Mercer, ma'am?" he offered. But before she could answer, a voice behind her, low and rough like stone, said, "Eleanor Price." She turned and her breath caught. The man was tall, with shoulders that blocked out the sun and pale blue eyes that looked right through her. A thin white scar cut across his weathered face. A gun sat low on his hips, in a holster worn from use. This was no simple rancher. This was a man who knew trouble. This was Caleb Mercer. "I'm Eleanor Price," she said, her voice shaking just a little. He just stared, his cold eyes taking in her worn dress and her nervous hands. "The stage is late," was all he said. No welcome, no greeting. He lifted her trunk like it was nothing and loaded it onto a nearby wagon. Eleanor hesitated. This was her final chance to run. But where to? Back to the city where she was starving and helpless? No. Forward was the only way. She walked to the wagon and Caleb helped her up. His hand was calloused and strong, but his touch was impersonal. They rode out of town without another word between them. The silence on the ride was heavy. The farther they went into the wild country, the more alone Eleanor felt with this quiet, intimidating stranger who was supposed to be her husband. Desperate, she tried to make conversation. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. 7 years, he clipped out. His short answers made it clear he wasn't one for talking. He was all business, even when he wordlessly handed her a heavy blanket as the night grew cold. His ranch was tucked away in a small valley. It was simple and practical, built for work, not comfort. Inside, the house was just as stark. No curtains, no rugs, just what was needed to survive. On the fireplace mantel, however, sat a single small photograph of a smiling woman and a young boy. Before Eleanor could ask, Caleb spoke. "We need to discuss expectations," he said, his voice flat. "This is a hard life. I need a partner, not a princess. Someone who can manage a house and handle herself when I'm gone." He was offering her a job, not a marriage. Weeks turned into months. Life was hard, but Eleanor was tougher. She learned to cook, clean, and mend, turning the empty house into a home. She even tended a small garden. Caleb remained distant, a ghost in his own house, haunted by the wife and son in the photograph. One day, a man from her past showed up in town. The cruel factory foreman she had fled in Boston. He had followed her, and he meant to cause trouble. He confronted Eleanor when she was alone, but this was not the same scared woman he once knew. When he grabbed her, she fought back with a strength she never knew she had. Just then, Caleb appeared, his face a mask of cold fury. The foreman didn't stand a chance. After Caleb sent the man running with a clear warning never to return, he finally looked at Eleanor. He saw the fire in her eyes, not fear. That night, he finally told her about his first wife, Sarah, and their son, who were lost in a raid years ago. He had closed himself off to keep from feeling that pain again. Seeing Eleanor defend herself made him realize she was not fragile. She was a survivor, just like him. It was a new beginning. They built a real marriage on respect and shared strength, proving that home is not a place you find, but something you have the courage to build. Eleanor met his gaze head-on. "Mr. Mercer, I ran a house, worked 16 hours a day in a mill, and crossed 3,000 miles by myself. I am not easily broken." A hint of respect showed in his eyes. "Good. You will need that grit. The arrangement is simple. You get a roof, meals, and my name for protection. In return, you run this house and do not ask about my business. This is a partnership, nothing more. You will have your own room." Relief washed over her. "One more thing," he said, his voice turning hard. "I have killed men to protect what is mine, and I would do it again. If that scares you, speak now." Instead of fear, she felt a strange calm. "Does that mean you will protect me from anyone who tries to harm me?" she asked. He seemed taken aback. "Yes." "Then I am not scared," she said. "I am grateful." He stared at her for a long moment. "Let us make this official." He produced a contract. It was all there in black and white: room, board, protection, and a small wage. Her duties were to run his home as his wife in name only. No other expectations were mentioned. She signed, feeling like she was sealing her fate. "I will file these in town tomorrow," he said. "We will be married by the end of the week." He then showed her to a clean but bare room. "This is yours. I am across the hall." And with that, she was alone. She sat on the bed feeling numb. It was not freedom, just a different kind of cage. She pulled out her mother's journal and read the last words. "Eleanor is braver than she knows." Was this brave, or was she just giving up? Listening to the wind howl outside and the footsteps of the stranger across the hall, she wondered if there was any difference between choosing to survive and just being a survivor. Too exhausted to change, she lay down and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally took her. She awoke to the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood. For a second, she was lost. Then yesterday came rushing back: the ranch, the contract, Caleb Mercer. Aching all over, she got up. He must have brought fresh water while she slept. She washed her face and changed into a simple cotton dress. In the small mirror, she saw a pale, frightened 23-year-old who already felt a lifetime older. The steady chopping sound continued outside in the gray dawn. When she left her room, she saw Caleb through the window. He was chopping wood, his shirt off despite the chill. She could not look away from the powerful muscles of his back or the web of old scars that told their own violent stories. He was handsome in a way that was dangerous and wild. Suddenly he turned, and their eyes met. A blush crept up her neck as he held her gaze, his face unreadable. He sank the axe into the block and reached for his shirt. She hurried to the kitchen. The kitchen was simple and worn. She started making coffee just to have something to do. Caleb came in, his hair wet. "You did not have to get up," he said. "I am used to it." She kept her voice even. "Can you cook?" he asked, grabbing a skillet. "Enough to get by," she replied. "Good," he said. "I cannot." They made breakfast in a tense silence. He kept a careful distance, but showed her where the supplies were kept before he had to ride out to check on the cattle. Over breakfast, he laid out her duties: the chickens, the garden, the house. He would handle the cattle and the heavy work. "I am gone most days, sun up to sundown," he explained. "I do not mind being alone, Mr. Mercer." "Caleb," he corrected her gently. "We should use our given names." "Caleb," she repeated, the name feeling foreign. "And I am Eleanor." He nodded, seeming to approve. "There is a rifle over the fireplace," he said, changing the subject. "Do you know how to use one?" The question surprised her. "I will teach you," he said, stacking the plates. "Out here, a person has to know how to handle themselves. We get bears down from the mountains. Wolves, too. And some men are worse than any animal." Eleanor felt a chill. She wanted to ask what he meant, but was afraid of the answer, afraid to face how alone she truly was. Caleb must have noticed her fear. "I am not trying to scare you," he said softly, But this is not Boston. The closest neighbor is 5 miles off. If trouble comes, you have to count on yourself first." "I understand," she said. He looked at her with those pale, searching eyes. "This land does not forgive weakness, Eleanor. I need to know you are strong enough." She met his gaze. "I watched my mother waste away because we had no money for a doctor. I worked in a mill where women lost fingers and were thrown out for it. I crossed this country all alone with nothing but grit. I can handle this, Caleb. I have no other choice." Something in his hard expression softened. "No," he said quietly. "I reckon you do not." After breakfast, he showed her the ranch. The chickens were simple enough. The garden, however, was a constant struggle against the rocky soil. In the barn were 2 horses, a big gelding named Ranger for him and a smaller mare, Sable, for her. "She is a gentle horse," Caleb said, stroking her neck. "She will not give you any trouble." Eleanor held out her hand. The mare's breath was warm on her palm. "I have never ridden a horse before. I will teach you that, too. You have to be able to get to town if I am not around." The thought of an emergency made her anxious, but she just nodded. They walked the edges of his land while he pointed out creeks and hills. He told her he ran about 200 head of cattle, selling them to the army and the miners. Sometimes he hired out as a tracker. "You track for the army?" she asked. "Now and then. When they need a man who knows this country." His tone was flat, but she felt there was more to the story. "Is it dangerous?" "All work out here is dangerous," he said, glancing at her. "You are thinking about what that fellow on the stagecoach said." It was a statement, not a question. She did not deny it. "Folks seemed nervous when I said your name." Caleb stopped and turned to face her. The mountains stood sharp against a bright blue sky. "I told you before that some of those stories are true. I have put men in the ground. I will not pretty it up for you. I am not asking you to. I am just trying to understand the man I married." "A careful one," he said, his jaw tight. "The war taught me that waiting gets you killed. I came here to build something, not destroy it. But I learned my lesson well. I protect what is mine, Eleanor, and I do not give second chances to threats." "Were those men threatening you?" she asked. "Every last one," he said in a flat voice. "Reed Callahan and his kin tried to run me off this land. I gave them a chance to leave. They chose not to. A card sharp in town pulled a gun when I caught him cheating. I was quicker. 3 others tried to jump my claim in the middle of the night. I heard them coming. And the sheriff? He knows it was self-defense every time. I do not go looking for trouble, Eleanor, but I do not back down from it either." They stood there, the silence heavy between them. "You said you protect what is yours," she said. "Does that mean me?" Caleb's face softened just a bit. "Yes. From the moment you signed that paper. Anyone who bothers you will have to answer to me." She did not feel fear. Instead, she felt something else entirely. For the first time in a long, long while, she felt safe. Someone was finally standing between her and all the world's troubles. Caleb broke the quiet. "I best get to work," he said. He told her there was meat and vegetables for supper, then saddled his horse, Ranger, and rode out without a look back. He was a stranger, and now he was her husband. The days settled into a rhythm. She worked around the house, and he worked the ranch. They ate their suppers in silence. It was like living with a ghost, sharing a home but never connecting. But then, slow as a sunrise, things began to change. One morning, Eleanor found fresh milk waiting in the spring house. A few days later, he came back from town with new fabric and thread. He just sat them on the table. When she looked at him, he said, "Your dresses are worn. A woman ought to have proper clothes." A week after she arrived, he fixed a loose board on the porch she had mentioned just once. Then a small bookshelf appeared, filled with novels and poetry. "I saw you reading your mother's journal," he told her. "Figured you might want something new." She was so touched she could hardly speak. In Boston, books were a treasure she could never afford. Caleb had seen a need she never spoke aloud. She started noticing other things, too. How gentle he was with the animals, a stark contrast to how he dealt with men. She saw the care he took with his tools, keeping everything in perfect order. The man never raised his voice, not once. She realized that whatever violence was in him, he kept it chained down with iron discipline. She learned his habits. He was up before the sun, splitting wood. He walked the property line every single morning. And every night, without fail, he would sit and clean his weapons, a rifle, a shotgun, and a pistol, with the focus of a holy man. She finally asked him about it one night. Why check them every day? Caleb looked up from his rifle. During the war, I saw good men die because their weapon failed them. I swore mine never would. Do you expect to need them? She asked. I hope not, he answered. But hope is not a survival strategy. Being prepared is what keeps you living out here. He picked up his pistol. That is why I'm going to teach you to shoot. You need to be able to protect yourself if I'm not around. This world ain't kind. She bristled. I'm not helpless. No, he agreed, surprising her. You are not, but you are untrained, and that is just as dangerous. The shooting lessons began the next day. He was a patient teacher, correcting her stance and her grip until she got it right. You are a natural, he said after a week. That little bit of praise warmed Eleanor more than she cared to admit. Words from Caleb were rare, so they carried weight. She began putting more care into her cooking, making better meals than just what was needed to get by. Caleb never said much, but he ate every last bite. One evening, she made an apple pie from the old trees out back. When she put it on the table, Caleb just stared. Something wrong? She asked. No, he said, his voice rough. I have not had pie in 7 years. When he looked up, his expression made her breath catch. My mother used to make apple pie before the war. It was the first time he had ever mentioned his family. Eleanor sat down, needing to understand this quiet man. Where is your mother now? She asked gently. Dead, he said. My father, too. Their farm in Missouri was burned during the war. I came home from fighting to nothing but ashes. He cut into the pie. I am sorry, she whispered. It was a long time ago. He took a bite, and she saw him swallow hard. This is good, real good. The silence that followed was different. It was comfortable. She dared to ask another question. The photograph on the mantel. Is that your family? Caleb's hand stopped. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. My sister, Mary, and her son, Daniel. They lived in Kansas. The sickness took them both 4 years back. The grief in his words was heavy enough to touch. Everyone I have ever loved is dead, Eleanor, he said, putting his fork down. That is why I live like I do, not because I am cold, but because caring for folks hurts too much when you lose them. Is that why you wanted a practical marriage? She asked. I thought I could have a partner without attachment, he admitted, looking her right in the eye. Something that would not break me when it was gone. But I am beginning to realize life does not work that way. In that moment, they were not strangers anymore. They were just two survivors trying to build a new life from the ruins of their old ones. About a week later, a rancher named Thomas Garrett rode up to the house. He was a big, loud man who looked at Eleanor like she was a piece of property he was thinking about buying. Well now, he boomed. You must be Mercer's mail-order bride. Eleanor stood up straight. I am Mrs. Mercer. Can I help you? Garrett just grinned. Mrs. Mercer, huh? Where is your husband? He is out with the herd. Shame, Garrett said, his eyes roaming over her again. Tell me, darling, how much did he pay for you? I might be in the market myself. A hot rage flared in Eleanor's chest. I am not for sale, Mr. Garrett. And if you have business with my husband, you can come back another time. You are not welcome here. That is mighty high and mighty for a man who bought himself a wife. Maybe you need a lesson in respect. The sharp click of a rifle hammer stopped him cold. Caleb stood 30 feet away, his rifle aimed right at Garrett's heart. "You were just leaving, Garrett," Caleb said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "And you will not be back." Garrett's hand twitched toward his pistol, but he froze when Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. "Now, Mercer, I did not mean no harm." "Yes, you did. You came on my land, you insulted my wife, and you threatened her. That is 3 mistakes. Most men do not even get to make one." Caleb stepped forward. "Get on your horse. If I see you near my wife or my land again, I will kill you. That is a promise." Garrett knew he was beat. "This is not over, Mercer," he snarled. "Oh, yes, it is. Touch what is mine, and you die." Caleb's voice cut through the Texas air, sharp and final. He told Garrett to spread the word. We watched him ride off, and only then did Caleb lower his rifle. His hands were rock steady, not a single tremor, while I was shaking like a leaf. He turned to me. "Are you all right?" I nodded. He was foul, but he never laid a hand on me. Caleb's jaw went tight as a drum. He was thinking about it. Other men will get ideas, too. They'll want to see if Marion has made me soft. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "They'll try to take what's mine." I knew right then I ought to feel something about being called property. But feeling like I belonged to Caleb was a whole lot better than being prey for men like Garrett. "You called me your wife," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You are my wife," Caleb stated, his voice softer now. "In name, by law, and in truth. Anyone who forgets that will have to answer to me." Later that night, he sat cleaning his rifle, a ritual I had come to expect. The quiet care he gave the weapon that saved me made me speak up. "Thank you," I said, "for what you did today." He didn't look up. "Protecting you is my duty." I shook my head. "It was more than that. You defended my honor." His hands stopped their work. "He insulted you. No man does that to my wife." "Even one you only married for convenience?" The question just hung there in the still air. Caleb finally put down the rifle and gave me his full attention. "Eleanor, I won't lie. I married you for practical reasons. I figured an arrangement like this would keep my heart safe." He took a breath. "But you are not just a solution anymore. You have become important to me." My own heart started to pound. "When that man looked at you with disrespect," he continued, his voice low, "I felt a rage I ain't felt in years. I find myself listening for your footsteps. And the thought of anyone hurting you," he met my eyes, "makes me want to burn the whole world to the ground." He stood up suddenly, as if the words themselves had burned him. "I'm going to check the fence line." He left before I could say a word, leaving me with the echo of his confession. This hard, lonely man was falling for me, and Lord help me, I was falling for him too. When he came back an hour later, I was waiting. I handed him a cup of fresh tea. "I need to tell you something," I started, my voice trembling a little. "I came here with no other choice. I was scared and alone. But I'm not staying because I have to, Caleb. I'm staying because I want to. Because for the first time in my life, I feel safe." He looked at me, his gaze so intense it nearly buckled my knees. "You are worth everything, Eleanor," he said quietly. "And that scares me more than any fight I have ever been in." I stepped closer to him. "I am scared too. But I am done letting fear make my choices for me." He raised a hand, his rough fingers gently touching my cheek. "I do not know how to be a gentle man." "Then we will just have to learn together," I whispered. "We have both lost so much," I said, covering his hand with mine. "Maybe it is time we started building something new." He pulled me into his arms then, holding on with a strength that was both fierce and tender. "I will protect you," he murmured against my hair. "From every last thing." I leaned into him, the pounding of his heart a steady rhythm against my ear. "I know you will," I whispered. "That is why I'm not afraid." In that moment, held safe in his arms, I knew I was home. We were two broken people finding a way to be whole again, and that was more precious than anything. As the seasons turned and a chill settled over the ranch, I noticed a change in Caleb. He became more watchful, his gaze always drifting to the horizon. His hand was never far from his sidearm. "What is it?" I asked one morning, watching him check his rifle for the third time. His jaw was set. "Probably nothing. Just a feeling." "What kind of feeling?" He was quiet for a spell. "The kind that has kept me alive all these years." His eyes found mine. "Someone has been watching this place. I found boot prints up on the north ridge. They do not belong to any of our neighbors." A cold knot of fear tightened in my belly. "Should we call the sheriff?" Caleb shook his head. "And tell him what? That I found some tracks? He would just say it is hunters and tell me not to worry." He set the rifle down, his stare hard as flint. "I am not worried, Eleanor. I am prepared." 3 days later, 5 head of our cattle were gone. Caleb rode back to the house, his face like a thundercloud. "Rustlers," he said, his voice a low growl. "Or someone trying to send a message." He was already gathering ammunition, his movements sharp and quick. "I am going after them. You stay inside. Keep this rifle close, and do not open the door for anyone. Understand? If I ride to town for help, that trail will be cold and those cattle will be gone for good." His voice was hard, but his hands were gentle on her shoulders. "I will be fine, Eleanor. I just need to know you are safe here." She saw the determination in his eyes and knew arguing was useless. This was the man he was. He protected what was his. She whispered, "Promise me you'll be careful." He kissed her forehead. "Always am." Eleanor watched him ride off on Ranger, a deep dread settling over her. The house felt empty, and every creak of the floorboards made her jump. Caleb returned near dusk, his face grim. The cattle were gone. The tracks vanished on rocky ground. Whoever took them knew the country well. "This was not random," Caleb said over dinner neither of them wanted. "He cut them from the herd like a professional. I recognized the boot print. I have seen it before." "Where?" His fist clenched on the table. "Reed Callahan. He has a small place about 15 miles north. We have a history." The name was new to Eleanor, but Caleb's controlled anger was terrifying. "He and his brothers tried to run me off my land. They chose a fight instead of walking away. I killed his brother James. Another, Seth, took a bullet to the shoulder. Reed was smart enough to drag him away before I finished it." Her blood ran cold. "You think he wants revenge?" "He is testing me," Caleb said, "seeing if marriage has made me soft." He looked at her, and beneath the anger, she saw fear, not for himself, but for her. "What will you do?" "I will ride to his place tomorrow. I will give him one chance to return my cattle. If he refuses—" The threat hung in the air. Eleanor covered his hand with hers. "Do not go alone. Take the sheriff. The sheriff will not get involved, and I will not risk another man's life for my problems. This is between me and Callahan. Then I am going with you." "Absolutely not," he said. "You will stay here where it is safe." "How am I safer here alone, Caleb?" She had a point. He finally agreed. "If you come, you do exactly as I say. No questions," Eleanor promised, her throat tight with fear. They left at first light. The ride to Callahan's ranch was tense. Caleb scanned their surroundings constantly, his rifle across his saddle. Eleanor found herself doing the same, her heart pounding with every sound. Finally, they crested a ridge and looked down on a small, run-down ranch. Smoke rose from the chimney. Caleb pointed. "See those 5 steers in the corner? Those are mine. I can see the brand from here." "What is the plan?" "We ride down there. I will see if Callahan is smart enough to make this easy." They rode into the valley. A tall, lean man with cruel eyes stepped out of the house. It had to be Reed Callahan. "Well, well," he drawled, his eyes flicking between them. "Caleb Mercer. I heard you got married. She is a pretty little thing. What kind of woman marries a killer?" Caleb dismounted slowly, his movements calm and controlled. You have 5 of my cattle in that corral, Callahan. I'm giving you one chance to return them. Your cattle? Callahan laughed. I found these wandering on open range, finders keepers. They have my brand. You stole them, and we both know it. Return them now, or this ends badly for you. Callahan's eyes narrowed as he weighed his chances against Caleb's reputation. Just then the door opened, and another man appeared. He was older, with a useless right arm hanging at his side. It was Seth, the brother Caleb had shot years ago. You have some nerve coming here making threats, Mercer, Seth snarled, especially with your woman. That is just careless. In a flash, Seth's good hand reached for a rifle leaning against the door. Caleb's pistol was out even faster, aimed right at him. The scene froze, balanced on the edge of bloodshed. Do not, Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. Touch that rifle, and I will kill you. I already crippled you once, Seth. Do not make me finish the job. Seth froze, murder in his eyes. Reed held up his hands, a false gesture of peace. Let us all stay calm. No need for anyone to get shot. You want your cattle, Mercer? Fine. Consider it a wedding gift. Seth, help him drive those 5 head out. Reed's voice hardened. We will settle this another way, another time. The word sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. This was not over. Callahan was just choosing his moment. Caleb kept his pistol aimed square at Reed. Eleanor, you stay put on that horse, he ordered, his voice low and steady. Do not get down. Just keep your eyes on Seth. Eleanor gripped the reins, the air feeling thick with unspoken violence. Seth, looking angry and clumsy, pushed the 5 stolen cattle toward them. Caleb counted each one, his gaze never leaving Reed. You satisfied now? Reed sneered. Got your cattle. Why don't you ride on out? This ain't over, Callahan. Caleb's voice was quiet, making it all the more menacing. Whatever revenge you're planning, you best leave it be, or you'll end up just like your brother James. Reed's false smile vanished. You took my brother. You crippled Seth. You really think I'd forget that? Caleb's voice was cold iron. Your brother drew on me first. Seth came at me looking for a fight. I defended myself on my own land. Any man would do the same. Caleb's finger rested on the trigger. But I am not here to argue about the past. You leave my family alone, or the next time we meet, I will not be so patient. For a long moment, they just stared, a history of violence hanging between them. Finally, Reed let out a cold laugh. I reckon that pretty wife of yours is your new weakness, Mercer. A man with something soft to protect ain't so willing to fight. The muscle in Caleb's jaw tightened. You bring her into this, Callahan, and there ain't a hole in all of creation deep enough for you to hide in. That was not a threat, Reed said, his eyes sliding to Eleanor. Just an observation. Ma'am, you might want to reconsider the man you married. He has a habit of getting folks hurt. Let's go, Caleb said, his voice tight. Drive the cattle ahead. Eleanor urged her horse forward, her heart pounding. She could feel the Callahans' hatred following them all the way up the ridge. When she finally dared to look back, she saw the 2 brothers standing there, watching. He's going to come for us, she whispered. I know, Caleb's voice was grim. He's been waiting 6 years for revenge. The ride home was silent and tense. By the time they reached their ranch, Eleanor's legs were shaking so badly she nearly fell from her horse. Caleb caught her, his hands surprisingly gentle. You did good, he said. You stayed calm. His words were a small comfort against the cold fear in her gut. What do we do now, she asked. Now we get ready. In the days that followed, Caleb worked tirelessly, reinforcing doors and teaching Eleanor to shoot with a new urgency. If they come and I go down, he told her one night, you ride for town. You do not stop and you do not look back. Just run. You have to promise me. His eyes were fierce. Promise me, Eleanor. I can handle anything so long as I know you are safe. But if something happened to you because of my past... He could not finish. I promise, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. That night, Eleanor lay awake, listening to every creak of the house. She thought about the life she had run from, and the quiet, dangerous man who now owned her heart. And she thought about the secret she had been keeping for 2 weeks, the one she had been too scared to tell him. She was pregnant with his child. She knew she had to tell him. A secret like that was a weakness, and they could not afford any. She got out of bed and crossed the hall. His door was open a crack, and she saw him sitting by the window, a rifle across his lap. "Caleb?" she whispered. He turned in an instant. "What is it? Are you hurt?" "No," she said, her heart hammering. I need to tell you something important." He set the rifle down, his face all sharp angles in the moonlight. "I am pregnant," she said, the words rushing out. "About 2 months now. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner." Caleb went completely still. For a terrible moment he said nothing. Then he stood and pulled her into an embrace so fierce it stole her breath. "A baby," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "We are having a baby. You are not angry." He pulled back, and she saw the glint of tears in his eyes. "Angry? Eleanor, you have just given me a future, something to build. I am terrified, yes, but angry? Never." Some grudges die hard, and Reed Callahan's was a wildfire aimed right at Caleb and his pregnant wife, Eleanor. Caleb knew it had to end. He told her, "I won't have our child born under this threat." He promised to give Callahan one last chance to walk away. But 2 weeks later, under a moonless Texas sky, their house was surrounded. Eleanor awoke to Caleb's hand on her mouth. "They're here," he whispered, pressing a pistol into her hand. "If it is not me coming through that door, you shoot." A crash of glass downstairs announced their arrival. "Eleanor Mercer!" Callahan's voice, thick with whiskey and rage, echoed through the house. "Time to pay your husband's debts." Caleb gave his wife one last look. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anything." He slipped out, becoming a predator in his own home. Eleanor heard his cold voice cut through the chaos, followed by the deafening roar of a rifle. The fight was a storm of noise, a symphony of breaking furniture and pained shouts that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Then, a sudden, terrifying silence fell. Every second felt like an hour as Eleanor waited, praying. Finally, slow, heavy footsteps climbed the stairs. She raised the pistol, her hands trembling fiercely. The steps stopped. "Eleanor," Caleb's voice was strained and rough. "It is me." She threw the door open and gasped. He was covered in blood, bruised and battered, but he was alive. "Are you all right?" she cried, reaching for him. "It is not my blood, mostly," he said, leaning hard against the doorframe. Downstairs was a scene of pure carnage. 2 men were dead. Reed Callahan was slumped against a wall, clutching a bloody wound in his side, his face a mask of hate. Caleb stood over him, rifle aimed steady. "I told you to walk away, Reed." Callahan just coughed up blood and cursed him. Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. He was about to end it for good. But then Eleanor's hand gently closed over his arm. "Don't, Caleb," she whispered. He looked at her, his eyes full of confusion and fury. "This man tried to kill us." "I know," she said, her voice finding a strength she did not know she had. "But killing him now, like this, that is not self-defense. That is just revenge. We are better than that." Caleb stared at his wife, a war raging inside him between the man he was and the father he wanted to be. Slowly, he lowered the rifle. He looked down at Callahan. "The law will handle you now. But if you ever come near my family again, I will finish this. That is a promise." Reed just spat. "Letting your woman make your choices, Mercer?" Caleb's boot shot out, making Reed scream. "My woman just saved your worthless life." After Caleb rode for the sheriff, Eleanor stood guard. She looked at the destruction and finally understood. Love in this land was a fierce, protective thing. It required a man who could be both a gentle husband and a stone-cold killer. She put a hand on her belly, promising her child they would know both sides of their father. She loved them both, because both were necessary to survive. Sheriff Tom Harris arrived at dawn. He was a veteran lawman who had seen it all. He took one look at the scene, at Eleanor standing guard with the rifle, and understood. "You can put that down now, Mrs. Mercer," he said gently. "We will take it from here." Caleb was instantly at her side, taking the heavy rifle from her weary arms. The town doctor confirmed Callahan would live, and the sheriff turned to Caleb. "Two hired drifters, I reckon." Caleb nodded. "They made their choice when they kicked in my door." Sheriff Harris listened as Caleb told the story, his voice flat and factual. It was a clear-cut case of a man defending his home and his pregnant wife. He looked at Eleanor. "Is that how it happened, ma'am?" She nodded, her voice clear. "Yes, Sheriff. They came for us, and my husband protected us." The sheriff gave a single decisive nod. For him, that was the end of it. The threat was over. In the quiet morning light, Caleb held Eleanor close, their family forged in fire, and now finally safe. The sheriff nodded slowly. "I have known Caleb Mercer for 7 years. He is a hard man, but he is not an instigator. Reed Callahan, on the other hand," he said, looking at the wounded man, "is a known troublemaker, accused of claim jumping last year. He is a thief and a coward." The young deputy looked pale. "Sheriff, what about these other two?" "We will take them back to town. As for you, Reed Callahan," the sheriff said, walking over to him, "I am arresting you for attempted murder. If you survive, you will stand trial. If you do not, well, you brought this on yourself." "This is not over, Mercer," Reed hissed, burning with hatred. The sheriff cut him off. "Assuming the judge does not hang you. Attacking a pregnant woman in her own home is a serious crime in Montana territory." After the sheriff took Reed away, Caleb led Eleanor upstairs, away from the chaos. He knelt before her, his hands on her knees. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with worry. "The baby?" "We are fine," she whispered, covering his trembling hands with her own. "Scared, but fine. Caleb, what you did tonight." "I killed 2 men," he said, the words stark and brutal. "You protected us." Eleanor cupped his face, making him meet her eyes. "Those men came here to kill you and to hurt me. You did what you had to do." "It was a man named Callahan. He and his men did not just want the cattle, they wanted to use me as a hostage against Caleb." "You did what you had to," I told him later, holding his trembling hands. "I have taken lives before," Caleb said, his voice broken. "In the war, and after. I always told myself it was necessary, but tonight, when I heard Callahan calling your name, knowing they had come for you," his grip tightened. "I felt a rage so dark it nearly consumed me. Something inside me wanted to tear it all down just to keep you safe." I pulled him onto the bench beside me and wrapped my arms around him. "But you did not burn the world down," I whispered, holding him tight. "You protected our home. You fought smart, not just with rage. And when I asked you to spare that last man, you listened. That is not a monster, Caleb. That is a good man." A deputy said they would need statements later in town. After the lawman left with the bodies, an awful silence fell over the wrecked house. "We have to clean this place up," Eleanor said, her voice shaky. "Not you," Caleb said, wincing from his own bruises. "You need to rest. I will handle it." "We will handle it," she said firmly. "This is our home. We will fix it together." They worked all day, scrubbing and mending. It was hard, grim work. He had a shallow knife wound on his side that made him move stiffly. As they cleaned, they talked more than they ever had before. He told her about the horrors of the war, that still ran wild in his sleep. He spoke of coming home to find his family gone, leaving him with nothing but a deep, burning rage. He talked about this land being the only thing that kept him from falling apart. Eleanor then told him about watching her own mother fade away, helpless. She spoke of the mill and a foreman whose looks felt more and more like a threat. It was that certain misery that made her answer Caleb's ad, choosing a dangerous unknown over a surefire dead end. "I was terrified when I got here," Eleanor admitted, scrubbing a tough bloodstain from the floor. "They all said you were a dangerous man." Caleb's voice was low. "They weren't wrong." "You are dangerous," she agreed, looking right at him, "to anyone who threatens what you love. There is a big difference." She saw the real Caleb, the man who brought her books and fixed things she barely mentioned, the man who taught her how to handle a gun to protect herself. "That is who you are, Caleb," she said. "The violence. That is just what you do to protect the good things." He swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "I do not want our child growing up thinking I'm a killer." "Then do not be," she said, taking his scarred hands. "Reed Callahan is locked up. His boys are gone. The danger is past. You get to choose now. You choose what kind of man, what kind of father you are going to be." "It is not that simple. There is always another Callahan." "Maybe," she said, placing his hand on her belly. "But this baby deserves a father who is both strong and gentle, who knows when to fight and when to build. I reckon you can be that man, Caleb." He stared at his hand on her stomach, a mix of awe and fear in his eyes. "What if I cannot change?" "Then I will be here to remind you," she whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We are going to build something good here, Caleb. A home, a family. But you have to choose it too." They spent the rest of the day cleaning. When they finished, the house looked almost right again. But Eleanor knew some scars do not just wash away. That night, Caleb's nightmares came back hard. She found him tangled in sweaty sheets, his face a mask of pain. "Caleb," she said softly, touching his shoulder. "Wake up. You are dreaming." His eyes flew open, wild and empty. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron, and she gasped. Then he saw her, truly saw her, and let go. "I hurt you," he said, horror filling his voice. "I am sorry." "It is all right. You were dreaming." She sat on the bed, rubbing her wrist. He ran a shaky hand through his hair. "The war," he said, his voice breaking. "Then it was last night. But in the dream, I was too slow. I heard you screaming, and I could not get to you." Eleanor pulled him into her arms and just held him. This powerful, dangerous man was not afraid of dying. He was terrified of failing the people he loved. "I am here," she whispered. "I am safe." "But what about next time?" The words spilled out. "When the baby is here, and I am miles away with the herd. I cannot be everywhere, Eleanor. I cannot always protect you." "Stop," she said, framing his face with her hands. "You cannot control everything, Caleb. Nobody can. All we can do is live our lives and face whatever comes together. The life we are building is worth the risk." His voice was raw. "How can you be so calm?" "Because I choose to trust you," she said, placing his hand back on her belly. "This baby will be born into a world with danger. But they will also be born into a world with you in it. A father who would move heaven and earth to keep them safe. That is worth everything." He stared at her, then pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I do not deserve you. Yes, you do. You just do not believe it yet." They stayed that way until his breathing evened out. She knew she should go back to her own bed, but she could not leave him. She lay down beside him, and he held on to her like she was his only anchor in a storm. "Eleanor," he whispered in the dark. "I love you. I should have said it sooner. I am not good with words, but I love you more than anything. The thought of losing you scares me more than any fight ever has." Tears filled her eyes. "I love you too, Caleb. All of you. The dangerous parts and the gentle parts." The days that followed were for healing. Caleb worked himself to the bone fixing the house, as if mending the wood could mend the wounds inside him. He put in new windows and a stronger door. But Eleanor saw the toll it took. He jumped at loud noises, and dark circles lived under his eyes. His hand was always near his gun. A week later, they rode to town to give their statements to Sheriff Hendricks. The townsfolk whispered as they passed. Some looked at Caleb with fear, others with a kind of respect. In the sheriff's office, they told the story again. Reed Callahan made it through the surgery, Hendricks told them. He's locked up tight. With all the witnesses, I expect he will hang or die in prison. And his brother Seth? Caleb asked. Vanished. Probably halfway to California by now. He knows he's a wanted man. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying Caleb. I have been sheriff here for 12 years, Mercer. I have seen men like you before. Men with violence in their blood who just want to live a peaceful life. It is a hard road to walk. I am trying, Sheriff. I know you are, Hendricks said, his eyes moving to Eleanor. You have got a good woman there who believes in you. Do not you make her regret it. I will not, Caleb promised. As they left, they came face to face with Thomas Garrett, the rancher who had insulted Eleanor before. He blocked their path on the boardwalk, a fake smile on his face. Mercer, he said. Heard about your trouble with Callahan. Rough business. It is handled, Caleb said, his voice flat. I'm sure it is, Garrett said, his eyes sliding over to Eleanor. Mrs. Mercer, I wanted to apologize for my words the other day. I was out of line. Eleanor felt Caleb tense up beside her. She could feel the anger rolling off him. She put a hand on his arm. Apology accepted, Mr. Garrett. Now, if you will excuse us. She led Caleb away before things could get worse. Halfway down the street, he spoke, his voice tight. He is not sorry. He is just scared, I know. But we got what we came for without a fight. That is progress, Caleb. You are learning to pick your battles. He relaxed a little. You are teaching me to pick my battles, he corrected her. At the general store, a kind woman named Mrs. Chen heard about the baby and fussed over Eleanor. You take good care, dear, she said, adding extra things to their supplies. Herbs for sickness, cloth for baby clothes, and a book about childbirth. First babies can be a trial, and you two are so far out of town. If you need anything, you just send word. Mrs. Chen's kindness nearly brought Eleanor to tears. The midwife had seen it all and promised to be there for her. Later, Caleb was quiet, lost in thought. He told Eleanor he had spent too many years pushing people away, thinking that being alone was safer. He believed violence was the only answer because he had nothing to lose. Caleb finally saw that true strength wasn't just in a fast draw, but in having good neighbors. As they rode home, Eleanor felt a real hope bloom inside her. This was the change she had prayed for. As the days grew colder and her belly grew rounder, their life found a peaceful rhythm. Evenings were spent with Caleb in the barn, crafting a cradle by lamplight while she sewed. One night, holding up a tiny shirt, she said, "We ought to think on a name. If it is a boy, how about we name him after your father?" Caleb paused his work. "John, my father's name was John." His voice was heavy with feeling. "He would have loved you." He looked at her, his eyes soft. "And if it is a girl, Margaret, after your mother, so our daughter will know the woman who raised someone so strong." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. The circuit judge arrived in late November for Reed Callahan's trial. Eleanor and Caleb told their story, and other folks from town backed them up. Callahan didn't have much to say for himself. His lawyer's excuses fell flat. The jury came back in less than an hour, guilty. The judge gave him 20 years in prison. As guards led him away, Callahan looked at Caleb. "I hope she was worth it, Mercer." Caleb pulled Eleanor close. "She was worth everything, and I will live to see my children grow, which is more than you can say." Leaving the courthouse, folks nodded at them with a newfound respect. They were finally becoming part of the town. That night, Caleb held her tight. "You saved me," he whispered. "You showed me another way to live." Eleanor touched his face. "We saved each other, Caleb. I was lost, and you were my lifeline." Their love that night was about new beginnings, a future they were building together. She had arrived as a mail-order bride, terrified of a dangerous man. But he had become the gentle soul she needed, and their practical arrangement had blossomed into a fierce, true love. Winter settled deep across the ranch, blanketing everything in a quiet white. Caleb worked tirelessly, securing the barn and stocking their cellar for the cold months ahead. Eleanor, her belly now round with their child, felt a peace she had never known. She prepared their home for the baby, feeling a deep contentment as she filled the nursery Caleb had built. She was turning their small house into a real home, a safe harbor for the family they were creating. One cold December morning, the sound of approaching horses made Eleanor's heart jump. Old fears died hard. Caleb came out from the barn, his rifle held loosely but ready. She stepped onto the porch just as Sheriff Hendricks rode up with an older man wearing a U.S. Marshal's badge. "Sheriff," Caleb greeted them, his gaze steady on the stranger. "What brings you all the way out here?" The sheriff nodded. "Caleb, Eleanor, this is U.S. Marshal Davis. He has some news about Callahan." The marshal's face was serious. "Mr. Mercer, I am afraid Reed Callahan died 3 days ago in prison. The doctor said it was pneumonia." Eleanor felt Caleb tense beside her and took his hand. "I see," Caleb said, his voice low. "Thank you for letting us know." "There is more," the marshal said, pulling out a folded paper. "Before he died, Callahan signed a full confession. He admitted to everything, and he made it clear you acted in self-defense both years ago and in the recent attack." Caleb stared at the paper, his hand shaking. "Why would he do this?" he asked, his voice thick. "The prison chaplain said he wanted to make peace," the marshal explained. "He said, and I am quoting, 'Merck was right to defend what was his. I was wrong. Let his family live without the weight of my mistakes.'" Caleb fought to control his emotions. "I did not want him to die," he whispered. The sheriff put a hand on his shoulder. "You chose mercy, son." And that confession was his way of saying he finally understood that. Now, holding another man's confession, a paper full of wasted hatred, Caleb knew he could have ended up just the same, alone and bitter. But Eleanor had changed everything. She had shown him a different path. He told her, "If you had not come here, I might have died still fighting ghosts." Eleanor leaned against him, sharing her warmth. "You chose differently," she said. "We both did." That night, Caleb burned the last relics of his violent past in the fireplace. He watched the flames consume the letters and clippings. He told Eleanor he wanted their child to know him as a man who built things, who chose love over hate. As deep snows covered the land, they spent the evenings reading. Caleb would place his large, scarred hands on her belly, marveling at the strong kicks of the baby. In February, Mrs. Chen made the hard journey out to their ranch. She declared both mother and baby healthy. Then she proceeded to tell Caleb every single detail of what to expect during birth. The color drained from his face. Mrs. Chen just chuckled. She had seen the toughest men faint, but she told him, "You have a spine of iron, Mr. Mercer. I think you will manage." But that night, Caleb's iron spine seemed to tremble. He held Eleanor, his hand resting protectively on her belly. His voice broke as he spoke. "I cannot lose you, Eleanor." She turned to face him, their child moving between them. "Nothing is going to happen," she promised. "We have fought too hard for this happiness to let worry poison it now." The first real pain came on a bright morning in late March. It stole her breath. She found Caleb mending a fence. One look at her face and he knew. "It is time," she said. He was by her side in a heartbeat, his hands fluttering nervously. "Ride safe," she told him as he left to get Mrs. Chen. "I need you whole." The hours that followed were the longest of Eleanor's life. Caleb returned with the midwife, who immediately took charge. Day faded into a long, difficult evening. Eleanor walked and breathed through the pain, clinging to Caleb's hands. He stayed right there, his face pale but steady, whispering words of encouragement. Then a problem arose. "The baby is positioned wrong," Mrs. Chen said quietly. What followed was pure agony, as the midwife tried to turn the baby. "I cannot do this anymore," Eleanor sobbed, completely spent. But Caleb's voice was fierce in her ear. "Yes, you can. Our baby needs you." With one last incredible push, she felt her body tear, and then a new sound filled the room. With one final mighty push, Eleanor brought their son into the world. A sharp, healthy cry cut through the quiet room. Mrs. Chen laughed, her voice warm. "It is a boy," she announced. "A strong and healthy baby boy." She laid the tiny, squalling infant on Eleanor's chest. Through tears of joy and pure exhaustion, Eleanor looked at her son. He was just perfect. Caleb made a sound, a mix of a sob and a laugh. He reached out a trembling hand to touch the baby's head. "He is so small," he whispered. "So perfect." "John," Eleanor said softly. "His name is John Mercer. Welcome to the world, little John." At his mother's voice, the baby's cries softened. He just snuggled against her. As Mrs. Chen finished her work, Caleb stared at his son, a look of pure wonder on his face. He looked so young in that moment. "Can I?" he hesitated. "Can I hold him?" With a smile, Mrs. Chen carefully passed the swaddled baby into Caleb's arms. He held his son with a powerful gentleness. The same hands that had seen so much hardship now held new life. "Hello, John," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I am your father. I do not know much about being a daddy, but I swear I will do my best. I will protect you and love you and your mother more than anything. You are my whole world now." Eleanor watched the tough, quiet man she married meet his son, and she saw him transform completely. He was no longer just Caleb Mercer, the rancher with a rough past. He was a father, a husband, a man building a beautiful life from scratch. Mrs. Chen and Sarah stayed for 3 days, helping them learn the ropes. John was a good baby, but he had a powerful set of lungs when he was hungry. "He has your stubborn streak," Caleb said, rocking a fussy John one night. Eleanor smiled. "And he has your persistence. He never gives up." When they were finally alone with their son, the weight of it all felt both terrifying and wonderful. Fatherhood changed Caleb Mercer down to his bones. He rose at every cry from his son, John, and his rough voice was the only thing that could sing the boy to sleep. The hardness in him began to melt away. Soon, neighbors who once kept their distance started stopping by. Thomas Garrett even came, hat in his hands, to say he was sorry for how he had acted. He admitted he had misjudged them completely. Caleb accepted, telling him that being a father changes a man's whole perspective. With new ranch hands hired, Caleb could spend his days with Eleanor and watch their son grow. Little John had his daddy's stubborn chin and curious blue eyes, and he took in the world with a fierce spirit that made them both proud. Caleb often told the boy stories of the land, promising him a future built with love, not defended by violence. Then one day news arrived that Seth Callahan was dead, killed in a fight. Caleb felt no victory, only a deep sadness for a life wasted on anger. He held Eleanor tight that night, thankful she had shown him a different way to live. When John turned 6 months old, the entire valley came to their ranch to celebrate. The sheriff pulled Caleb aside and told him he was no longer the man folks feared, but the one they trusted to be fair. Caleb looked across the yard at Eleanor holding their son and said he had a good woman to thank for that change. That night on the porch, Eleanor remembered the terror she felt on her first day there. Caleb confessed he thought he would always be alone, convinced his isolation was a strength. He said they were like two broken pieces that somehow fit together, making each other stronger than they ever were apart. Before they went inside, Caleb pulled her close. He told her he loved her, the words coming as easy as breathing now. As they went to comfort their fussing son, Eleanor knew this house was no longer a cold shelter, but a warm home. The dangerous man she was warned about had become the source of her deepest safety. She thought about how she came west expecting survival, but instead found a life she had stopped dreaming of. She had found a home, not in a place on a map, but inside the heart of a good man. Their future would hold more children and more good work, but tonight, being together was everything. After Caleb laid John back in his cradle, he turned to Eleanor with hope shining in his eyes. He offered her his hand, and she felt its calloused strength and its loving gentleness. She knew the life here would always be demanding, but it did not matter. They would face whatever came as long as they could face it together. The town had warned her that Caleb Mercer was a dangerous man, and they were right. He was dangerous to anyone who might threaten his family. But to Eleanor, he was gentle and patient, a man full of love. He was everything she and their son would ever need. Their life was simple. In the morning, John would cry for breakfast. Caleb would see to the animals, and Eleanor would feed their boy. They would work side by side, protecting the life they had made together. Some days would be hard and some would be joyful, but they would always share them. That was more than enough. It was everything. As Eleanor drifted off to sleep, she knew she had found her home. She had come out west looking for a way to survive, but she had found love instead. She had married a man with a fearsome reputation, only to find he was only dangerous to those who would bring them harm. She now understood that home was not a place on a map. Home was the feeling of Caleb's arms around her, and the sound of John's soft breathing from the next room. It was the promise that whatever life threw their way, they would face it as one. They had chosen love, and that choice made them unbreakable. Caleb Mercer was her safe place. He was her home.